She was sitting on a trunk in the middle of a dirt road in a thunderstorm when I found her, and the first thing she said to me was not help me or thank God or please. The first thing she said, looking up at me from the mud with rain coming down hard enough to make the whole world gray, was, "He left 3 hours ago. I watched his wagon until I couldn't see it anymore and then I sat down here because I didn't know what else to do." She said it without tears. That was the thing that stayed with me, not the storm, not the trunk, not the fact that she was alone on a Wyoming road in the middle of nowhere with the light going. The fact that she said it without tears, with the flat, exhausted honesty of someone who had already done the crying somewhere inside where it didn't show. My name is Harlan Cross. I am 32 years old. I own a cattle ranch in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming, 460 acres of high plains grassland that my father homesteaded when he came west in 1867 and that I have been working alone since he died 6 years ago, which is when I understood, for the first time, what the word alone actually meant when applied to a life rather than a moment. The ranch is called the Cross Bar. It sits at the end of a road that turns to mud in the rain, which is relevant to this story because that road is where I found her, coming back from Clearwater with feed supplies on the wagon in the kind of late June storm that comes off the Bighorn Mountains with almost no warning and turns the basin into a river in under an hour. I had seen the trunk from 100 yards out, a large, dark shape in the middle of the road that my horses were already hesitating at, the way horses hesitate at anything that does not belong in a familiar landscape. Then I saw that the trunk had a person beside it, and then I got close enough to see that the person was a woman, sitting in the mud, in a dress that had been appropriate for traveling and was now soaked through, with a hat that had given up any pretense of keeping the rain off and was simply sitting on her head as a formality. I pulled the wagon up beside her. I looked down at her from the bench. She looked up at me. Her eyes were green, and unusual green, the kind that reads differently in different light, and in the gray rain light of that moment they were almost the color of the grass after a storm, dark and alive and completely direct. She did not look frightened of me, which was the first thing I noted. She looked at me with the assessment of someone who is in a very bad situation, and is doing a rapid, honest calculation of whether this particular new element makes it better or worse. She did that calculation in about 3 seconds and then she said what she said. "He left 3 hours ago. I watched his wagon until I couldn't see it anymore, and then I sat down here because I didn't know what else to do." I said, "Who left?" She said, "The man I was supposed to marry." I said, "Where were you supposed to marry him?" She said, "His ranch, somewhere past Clearwater. I think I never got there." I said, "What happened?" She said, "He saw me at the stage stop and he left, didn't speak, didn't give a reason, just looked at me for about 30 seconds and then got in his wagon and drove away." She said this with the same flat honesty, no performance in it, and then she added, "I have $18 and a trunk full of my mother's china and no idea where I am." I got down from the wagon. I picked up one end of the trunk. She stood up without being asked and picked up the other end, and we loaded it into the wagon bed together, and I gave her my hand up to the bench, which she took with a brief firm grip and released immediately, and I got up beside her and I turned the horses back toward the crossbar because there was nowhere else to turn them. Her name was Nola Frey. She told me this about 10 minutes into the drive, when the rain had got worse and the road had got worse and I was focused on the horses, and she was sitting beside me with her soaked hat in her lap and her hair coming down from whatever arrangement it had been in, and she said, "I should tell you my name since you're taking me somewhere." I said, "Harlan Cross, the Cross Bar Ranch, it's about 3 miles. She said, "Nola Frey," she said, "from Ohio." She said, "I have never been further west than Pittsburgh before 6 weeks ago." I said, "What brought you 6 weeks ago?" She said, "A letter." She said it in a way that closed that particular door and I did not open it. I need to tell you about Nola the way she actually was, not the way the situation of finding her suggested she might be, not small, not broken, not in need of saving in the ongoing sense that the word saving usually implies. She was 23 years old and she had grown up in a town in Ohio that I never visited but that I came to know well through the way she described it. A mill town on a river with a particular gray quality to its winters, and a particular ambitious quality to its summers, and a family that was large and warm, and that she had left at 22, in response to a letter from a man in Wyoming who had writ to a matrimonial agency and whose letter had been, she told me much later, very well writ. Which was the thing that had convinced her. The letter had described the land and the life and what he wanted in a partner, and it had sounded, she said, like a person worth traveling for. The person had seen her at the stage stop and left. I never learned why. I do not know what he saw in those 30 seconds that made him turn his wagon around and drive away from a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry him, and I have thought about it more than I should have, and I have never found a satisfying answer. What I know is that the reasons were his and the consequences were hers, and the consequences were what I found on the road in the rain. The Crossbar Ranch house was warm when we got there because I had banked the stove that morning with enough wood to last through the day. I got the door open and Nola came in behind me and stood in the entryway doing the same assessment she had done of me on the road, the rapid, honest cataloging of a space, what it contained, and what it meant. The house was plain and functional, the house of a man who lived alone and did not entertain and had organized everything around the requirements of working rather than the requirements of being seen. There were books on the shelf by the east window. That was the one concession to something beyond the functional, the shelf of books that my mother had left and that I had added to over the years. Nola looked at the books before she looked at anything else. I showed her the spare room, which had been my father's room and which I had kept in reasonable order without any particular expectation of it being used. I found her dry clothes, a flannel shirt and a pair of work trousers that had been my father's and that were too large for her but that were dry and warm, and she took them with a thank you that was brief and genuine rather than performed. I heard her moving around in the room. I went to the kitchen and made food and put it on the table, and when she came out in my father's too large clothes with her wet hair braided back from her face, she sat down at the table and ate with the directness of someone who had been sitting in the rain for 3 hours and was not going to pretend she was not hungry. We talked through the meal. Not about the man who had left, neither of us went near that yet, it was too close to the surface and the surface needed time. We talked about other things, the ranch, what it took to run it, the Wyoming summer and what it was like after an Ohio summer, which were apparently different enough to constitute different seasons entirely. She asked good questions, practical ones, the kind that came from genuine curiosity about a way of life rather than the courtesy questions of someone filling silence. I answered them. She listened with an attention that I noticed immediately, the specific quality of a person who is actually taking in what you say rather than waiting for her own turn to speak. The storm lasted until midnight. By the time it stopped and the night was quiet outside and the creek that ran past the east side of the ranch was running fast and high with the runoff, we had been sitting at the kitchen table for 4 hours and I knew things about Nola Frey that I had not known about another person in 6 years of living alone on the crossbar. I knew about her mother's china and why it was important. Her mother had died 2 years before and the china was the one set of things that had been entirely her mother's, bought piece by piece over 20 years, and Nola had packed it and brought it with her across the country because leaving it behind had been impossible. I knew about her father, a quiet man who fixed watches, whose precision and patience she had clearly inherited. I knew about her two brothers, older both, who had thought the matrimonial agency idea was either brave or foolish, and had not been able to decide which. I knew that she had taught herself to read Latin from a book she found in the church library, because she had wanted to understand something about the language and there was nobody in her Ohio town who could teach her, which was the kind of detail that told you a great deal about the shape of a person. She knew things about me too, not as many because I have always been slower to give information than to receive it, but some. She knew about my father and the homesteading and the 6 years alone. She knew about the ranch and what I was trying to build with it and where I thought it could go in the next decade if the cattle markets held. She knew that I read, she had asked about the books and I had told her what was on the shelf and she had pulled one out and asked if she could borrow it and I had said yes, and she had put it on the table beside her like she was planning to start it tonight, which I liked. I told her she could stay as long as she needed to figure out what came next. I said it the same way I had said everything to her plainly without conditions because there were no conditions. She was a person in a difficult situation and she needed somewhere to be while she figured out the next thing and I had somewhere and the offer was simple. She said, I have $18. I said, I'm not asking for $18. She said, I don't take charity. I said, then work for your room and board, there's always work on a ranch. She looked at me with those green eyes across the table and said, what kind of work? I said, whatever needs doing, which is everything. She said, all right, just that, all right, and that was the deal. She was extraordinary at the work. I want to be honest about this because I had not expected it and my not expecting it was itself a thing I had to reckon with, the assumption I had made without quite making it consciously, that a woman from Ohio who had been heading to a matrimonial match would need to be taught the basics of ranch life from the beginning. Nola Frey did not need to be taught the basics of anything. She was a quick study at the things she did not know, and she already knew more than I expected about the things I assumed were new to her. She could ride, she told me she had grown up riding farm horses and the transition to ranch horses was not as large as I had anticipated. She could cook far better than I could, which she established on her second morning at the crossbar and which became without discussion a division of labor. She cooked, I did not. She had a way with the cattle that was quieter and more effective than many cowboys I had hired over the years. She moved among them without alarm, without the forced confidence that makes animals nervous, with the genuine patience of someone who has no need to prove herself to a cow. The mornings were the beginning of it. The particular quality of a ranch morning up before light, the cold air and the smell of the stove and the horses in the corral, has a way of stripping everything back to its essentials. And the essentials of those mornings were Nola and me in the kitchen before dawn with coffee and the day's work to organize, and the specific ease of two people who had found each other's rhythms quickly, and were moving in them without having to think about it. She would be up before me some mornings and the coffee would already be made when I came in, and I would find her at the kitchen table with the book she had borrowed from the shelf, reading in the lamplight with the complete absorption of someone who disappears into books the way other people disappear into sleep. I learned not to interrupt that. I would pour my coffee and stand at the window and look at the dark gradually becoming gray and the first shapes of the land appearing out of the night, and the kitchen would be warm and quiet, and it was simply good. The simple, daily, unremarkable good of a life that has the right things in it. I need to tell you something about myself now that I have been circling and that the story requires. I have told you about the ranch and the 6 years alone and my father and the work. I have not told you why in 6 years I had not made any effort to change the alone, and why the crossbar had remained the home of one person when ranches of that size in that period typically housed families, and why I had looked at the matrimonial agencies and the advertisements and the widows in Clearwater and the daughters of other ranchers in the basin, and had done nothing, engaged nothing, started nothing. The why is this: there had been someone before the 6 years before my father died, before the crossbar became entirely mine. His name was Vincent, and he had worked on the ranch for a year when I was 24. A drifting cowhand from New Mexico who had a way of talking about the land that I had never heard before, who read more than anyone I had known, who had a laugh that could fill a barn and a quality of attention when he was serious that made you feel like the only person in the county. I had not known going into that year what was happening. I had known by the end of it what had happened. He had left in the spring, not badly, not with a breaking of anything explicit because nothing explicit had been named, and I had watched his horse get small on the road south, and I had gone inside and I had lived with what I understood about myself from that year for 6 years, without knowing what to do with it except to be alone and work and read, and let the understanding sit in the specific private place where I kept things that had no clear home. This is what I am telling you. I knew what I was. I had known for 6 years. I lived on a high plains ranch in Wyoming in 1891, and there was no simple language for it, and there was no community for it, and there was no version of it that was possible in the open, public way of the world I lived in. There was only the private knowledge and the work and the 6 years, and now there was Nola Frey, sitting at my kitchen table in my father's too large clothes, reading a book by lamplight, and something was happening that I was paying attention to without yet knowing what to do with the paying attention. The first month passed in the rhythm of the work and the mornings and the meals. July in the Powder River Basin is the month of the full heat, the grass going golden and the sky going white-blue and the work getting longer as the days get longer, and Nola and I worked them together, the fence checking and the cattle management and the haying and the 100 small maintenance tasks that a working ranch requires. She got better at everything. She was learning at the rate of someone who learns by paying attention rather than by being told. And by the end of the first month, she was handling parts of the ranch work that I had been doing alone for 6 years with a competence that was entirely her own. We talked differently as the month went on. The early conversations had the quality of two people discovering each other carefully, testing the ground before putting weight on it. By mid-July, the conversations had a different quality, more direct, more willing to go somewhere less careful. She told me more about Ohio and the letter and the decision she had made to come west, and I understood from the way she told it that the decision had been about more than the man and his well-written letter. She had been looking for something different from what she had. She had been looking for a life that was larger than the one her town offered, a life that had room in it for the person she was rather than the person her town expected her to be. She had taken the matrimonial route because it was the route available, and the route had failed her at a stage stop in Wyoming, and she was sitting at a kitchen table at a ranch in the Powder River Basin figuring out what the next route looked like. I told her about Vincent. Not all of it, not the name or the full story or the understanding it had left me with, but I told her there had been someone, years ago, that the 6 years of alone had been partly chosen and partly not, that there were things about my life I had managed privately for a long time that did not have easy expression in the world I lived in. I told her this one evening in late July when the heat had finally dropped, and we were on the porch with the last of the light going over the big horns and the basin going dark below us. I told it imprecisely, in the way of someone feeling the edges of a thing rather than stating the center of it, and she listened with the full quality of her attention, and then she said, "I understand more of that than you might think." She said it looking at the mountains, not at me, and then she said, "The letter was from a stranger, but the reason I said yes to it was not about the stranger." She stopped, she said, "Some of the reason I needed to come somewhere different was about the things I understood about myself that Ohio did not have room for." She said this carefully, with the care of someone handling something fragile, and then she said, "I'm not going to say more than that right now. But I wanted you to know you were talking to someone who understood." I looked at the mountains and felt something shift, not dramatically, quietly, the way the light shifts in the evening, gradual and complete. I said, "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You told me something first." I said, "I know," she said, "that mattered." We did not talk about it again for a while. We did not need to, in the way that two people who have told each other something true do not immediately need to expand on it. The telling is its own thing, the acknowledgement is its own thing, and the rest can wait for the right conditions. The ranch work continued. The summer deepened. The conversations continued to go to real places, and we continued to be good together in the daily work, and the mornings and the evenings, and I continued to notice things that I had been noticing since the road and the rain. The noticing was the complication. I noticed the way she moved through the barn in the morning, the easy competence of it. I noticed the way she pushed her braid back over her shoulder when she was focused on something, an automatic gesture, completely unconscious. I noticed the way she laughed, not often, she was not a frequent laugher, but when she laughed it was real and full, and it filled the kitchen or the barn or the pasture with a quality of light that was not metaphorical. I noticed the way she looked at the land, the big horns at sunset, the basin in the early morning, the creek running after rain, with the specific attention of someone who is falling in love with a landscape and knows it and is letting it happen. I noticed all of this, and I held it the way I held the other private things, carefully, in the specific interior place where I kept everything that did not have a clear home. I told myself it was ordinary, the ordinary appreciation of a person whose company you have found good, the ordinary warmth of a friendship that is developed in the close quarters of shared work. I told myself this with diminishing conviction as August arrived. There was a day in mid-August that I keep returning to. We had been working the north fence line, a full day of it in the summer heat, and by late afternoon we were tired and dirty, and we had found a break in the fence near the creek that was worse than it had looked from the outside, and we had spent 2 extra hours on it. And when we finally finished and the fence was repaired, Nola sat down on the creek bank and took off her boots and put her feet in the water without asking permission or explaining herself. Just did it with the naturalness of someone doing what the situation clearly required. I sat down a few feet away. The creek was cold and clear, the good mountain-fed cold of the Powder River watershed, and the evening light was coming through the cottonwoods along the bank at the specific angle it came through at that hour, which made everything look like it was lit from inside. We sat there for a while in the silence of two people who have been working hard together all day and have earned a quiet. Then she said, not looking at me, looking at the creek, "Harlan, can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you happy here?" I thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. I said, "I am more happy here than anywhere else I've known." She said, "That's not quite the same as happy." I said, "No, it's not." She said, "What would make it the same?" I looked at the creek for a moment, then I looked at her. She was still looking at the water, her feet moving slowly in the current. The evening light on the side of her face and her profile had that quality it sometimes had when she was thinking, the clean, focused quality of someone fully present in a moment. I said, "Having the right things in it." She turned and looked at me. Those green eyes in the evening light, the particular shade they turned at this hour, and something in them that was the same as what I had seen on the road in the rain, the rapid, honest assessment, the calculation of whether the new element made things better or worse. She held the look for a moment that was longer than casual. Then she said, "Yes," just that, "yes," and then she looked back at the creek. I have thought about that yes many times, and I still cannot tell you with complete certainty what it meant in that moment. I think it meant, I heard what you said, and I think we might be saying the same thing from different directions, and I am not ready to say more than yes right now. I think it meant the beginning of something that was going to need time and honesty and the right conditions. I think it meant that we were both aware of something that neither of us had named, and that the numbing was coming but was not yet here. August ended. The summer work peaked and then began to turn toward fall, the light changing quality in the way it does when August tips into September, and the basin going from gold to a deeper, more complex color, and the nights getting cold in a way that meant more wood for the stove and longer evenings inside, and a different quality of the time Nola and I spent together in the kitchen and on the porch. There was a man in Clearwater named Edmund Hale, who owned the dry goods store and who had been a widower for 3 years, and who began in September to pay attention to Nola. He saw her first at the Clearwater General Store when I had taken her into town for supplies, and he introduced himself with a directness that I watched from 2 steps away and did not know what to do with. He was 40, a solid man with a decent reputation and a house in town, and no difficulty expressing his interest. He came out to the crossbar twice in September with pretexts that were thin and obvious. He spoke to Nola with the formal courtesy of a man conducting a courtship, and Nola received him with the polite containment she had for anything she was not sure about yet. I watched this from the outside. This is the part of the story I am least proud of, not because of what I did but because of what I failed to do, which was to examine honestly what I was feeling, and to say something about it rather than continuing to hold it in the private interior place and managing the outside carefully. I watched Edmund Hale drive out from Clearwater, and I felt something I did not immediately name, a tightness in my chest that was not anxiety about Nola's Wolbup. That was something more particular and less selfless, and I named it eventually but too late, which meant I spent 2 weeks performing a neutrality I did not feel and giving Nola no information about where I stood while she tried to figure out what she was doing. She asked me about him. On a Tuesday evening in mid-September, she said, "What do you think of Edmund Hale?" I said, "He's a decent man, good reputation, the store is well run." She said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "What did you ask?" She said, "What do you think of him for me?" I looked at my coffee cup. I said, "I think you should do what you feel is right." She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not fully read, and then she said, very quietly, "That is the least helpful thing you have ever said to me." She got up and went to her room, and I sat at the kitchen table alone, and I understood, sitting there, that I had just failed her in the specific way of someone who has feelings they will not name and uses neutrality as a disguise for cowardice. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the stove and I thought about Vincent and the year before he left and the 6 years after, and I thought about Wyoming in 1891, and what was possible and what was not, and what the cost of possible things was in a world that had strong opinions about it. And I thought about Nola on the road in the rain, and Nola at the kitchen table in my father's clothes, and Nola's feet in the creek, and Nola saying yes in the evening light, and Nola asking me what I thought of Edmund Hale and the look on her face when I told her to do what she felt was right. In the morning I found her already in the kitchen. She looked up when I came in with the expression of someone who has also not slept well and is performing a morning she is not entirely feeling. I poured coffee. I sat down across from her. I said, "Nola, I need to say something, and I need to say it plainly because I have been managing it instead of saying it, and that is not fair to you." She put down her cup. She looked at me. I said, "I am not a neutral party on the question of Edmund Hale. I have been performing neutrality, and it is not honest, and you deserve honest." She said, "Go on." I said, "I have been living alone for 6 years, and I told myself that was the right shape for my life given what I understand about myself and given the world we're in. And then I found you on a road in the rain, and you came to the crossbar, and the 6 years of that being the right shape, it stopped being right. It stopped being sufficient." I paused. "I am not going to make you a simple offer because the situation is not simple. I don't know what is possible for two people in the circumstances I've described. But I know that what I said last night was the wrong thing, and that I am not neutral, and that if Edmund Hale is coming out here with intentions, then you should know that there is something on this side of the question too." I stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove was going and the morning light was coming through the window, and Nola was looking at me with those green eyes, and her expression was doing something complicated that I was trying to read and could not quite. She said, "Harlan Cross, I have been waiting for something like that sentence for 2 months." I said, "I know, I'm sorry it took so long." She said, "Why did it take so long?" I said, "Because I am very practiced at holding things privately." She said, "I know." She said, "I am too." Pause. She said, "The things I told you in July about Ohio and what I understood about myself. I was telling you that I understood what you were telling me. I was telling you that the things about yourself that you manage privately, I have some of those too, different ones, but the same quality, the same kind of thing that doesn't have easy expression in the world we live in." She said, "I have been on this ranch for 3 months, and I have felt more like myself than I have since I was probably 17 years old. And the self I feel like here is not the self that was answering matrimonial letters. And I know that, and I've known it since about the third day, and I have been waiting for you to say something like what you just said because I didn't know how to say it first." The kitchen was completely still. The horses in the corral, the creek, the big horns, the whole enormous world of the Powder River Basin was outside, and in the kitchen there were two people who had just said true things to each other across a kitchen table, and the air had changed quality in the specific way of air that has had truth in it, which is different from the air that has only been breathed. I reached across the table. I put my hand over hers, palm to palm, the warmth of it real and complete. She looked down at our hands and then up at my face, and what was in her face was the thing I had been watching for without knowing I was watching for it, the fully unguarded version, the face she had when she stopped managing everything and let the actual thing through. She turned her hand over and her fingers closed around mine with the quiet certainty of someone who has made a decision and is done being uncertain about it. I said, "I don't know what this looks like going forward, in the world we're in." She said, "Neither do I." I said, "I know it's not simple." She said, "Harlan, I sat on a trunk in the mud in a thunderstorm because a man looked at me for 30 seconds and left. I have already survived not simple." I said, "That's true." She said, "Whatever this is, I would rather it be honest and complicated than simple and false." I said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." I said, "That's my position too." She looked at me for a moment, and then she did the thing she rarely did, the real laugh, starting quiet and building. and it filled the kitchen of the Crossbar Ranch on a September morning in Wyoming the way it filled every space it entered, with a quality of light that was not metaphorical and that I understood finally, completely, without any of the remaining reservation I had been holding. I was not going to be able to live without. Edmund Hale came out one more time in October. Nola spoke to him on the porch. I did not hear the conversation. He drove back to Clearwater and he did not come again. Nola came inside and she did not explain and I did not ask and we went back to the work. What we built after that September morning is hard to describe in the simple language of what things look like from the outside. From the outside it looked like a rancher and his housekeeper, or perhaps a rancher and a woman he had taken in out of charity, or perhaps some other arrangement that the people of Clearwater who saw us at the store filed under one category or another. From the inside it was what two people build when they have decided to be honest with each other about what they are and what they feel and what they need. When they have decided that the shape of the thing they are building is going to be determined by its actual materials rather than by what is easy to explain to other people. It was not without difficulty. I will not pretend it was without difficulty because the story deserves better than that. There were mornings when the privacy of it had a cost, when the constraint of the world we lived in sat between us at the breakfast table like something that had weight and had to be managed. There were days when Nola's situation was unresolved in the practical sense. She was neither the Crossbar's wife nor its employee nor anything with a clear name, and in the community of the Powder River Basin in 1891, the absence of a clear name had a cost. There were conversations about the future that were harder than the September morning had been, that required more from both of us than the first honesty had required. But the mornings were the same. The coffee and the lamplight and the book on the table and the work of the day ahead. The evenings were the same, the porch and the bighorns and the basin going dark and the specific quality of a silence that now had two people in it who had chosen to be in it together. The creek bank in late September when the cottonwoods went gold, Nola sitting on the bank with her boots off and her feet in the cold water and the light through the leaves, saying something dry about Wyoming geese that made me laugh in the way I had not laughed in 6 years and had not realized until then that I missed. The winter came early to the basin that year. The first snow in October, a heavy early storm that came off the mountains with the speed of a bad intention and put 2 feet on the ground in 30 hours and shut the roads and kept us on the ranch for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of the ranch entirely to ourselves, which sounds like a limitation but was in fact the opposite, was the long uninterrupted time in which two people who had been building something in the margins of working days finally had the room to build it in the center. We talked, we read. We cooked together, which we had not done because Nola cooked and I did not, but which in the snowbound kitchen became something different, became the collaborative process of two people figuring out how to occupy the same space in new ways. She taught me something from her mother's recipes. I taught her something I had learned from a New Mexican cowhand who had worked the ranch 8 years ago. The kitchen smelled of things neither of us had made before and the snow came down outside and the stove was warm and the crossbar was ours. I want to tell you about a specific evening in November. The snow had cleared by then and the world had the clean hard quality of early Wyoming winter and Nola had been at the crossbar for 5 months. We were in the kitchen after supper and she had pulled a letter from her coat pocket. She had gotten it at the Clearwater post office that week, from her brother in Ohio, the older one who had thought her plan was either brave or foolish and had apparently arrived at brave. The letter was long and she had read it privately and then she brought it to the kitchen and she said, "My brother wants to know when I'm coming home." She looked at the letter in her hands. She said, "He says the town is the same and the mill is the same and there's a teaching position that opened at the school." She said this without looking at me and the kitchen was very quiet. I said, "What are you going to tell him?" She said, "I don't know yet." She folded the letter. She looked up at me. She said, "What do you want me to tell him?" I looked at her across the kitchen table and I thought about the road in the rain and the trunk in the mud and the 30 seconds a man had looked at her and left and what it had taken her to sit down in the road instead of disappearing, instead of becoming someone else, instead of letting the world's management of her override the honest knowledge of herself. I said, "I want you to tell him what's true." She said, "And what's true?" I said, "That you are not the person who left Ohio, that you have been learning who you are for 5 months on a ranch in Wyoming and you are not finished learning, that the crossbar is that it is yours as much as it is mine if you want it." She looked at me. I said, "That is what I want you to tell him if it is also what is true for you." She held my gaze for a long moment with the green eyes in the November lamplight. She said, "It is true for me." I said, "Then tell him that." She wrote the letter that night at the kitchen table while I read by the stove. I did not read what she wrote. When she finished she folded it and set it on the table and she said, "Harlan." I looked up. She said, "Thank you for finding me on that road." I said, "I was coming back from Clearwater." She said, "I know you didn't have to stop." I said, "Yes I did." She said, "Why?" I said, because you were sitting in the mud in a thunderstorm, and you said he left 3 hours ago, and you watched his wagon until you couldn't see it and then you sat down because you didn't know what else to do. And that sentence had a person in it who was honest and dignified and completely without self-pity in a situation that warranted all three of those things, and I was not going to drive past that. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "That is the most you have ever said at one time." I said, "I've been practicing." She made the sound that was almost a laugh, and then it became the real one, and the kitchen filled with it, and outside the Wyoming winter was doing what Wyoming winters do, which is everything. And inside the crossbar the stove was warm and the lamplight was steady, and two people who had found each other in the specific way of people who needed finding were sitting at a kitchen table with their whole honest lives in front of them. That is not quite the end. The end is quieter than that. The end is the spring that came after the winter, the particular spring of the Powder River Basin when the snow goes off the big horns and the basin turns green and the creek runs high and the whole world smells of cold water and warming earth. The end is Nola in the south pasture on a May morning, checking the fence with the competence of someone who has done it dozens of times and knows exactly what to look for, her braid over her shoulder and her boots muddy and the big horns behind her enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to whatever human business is happening in front of them. The end is me watching her from the gate and knowing, with the clean, uncomplicated certainty of something that has been building for months and has finally arrived at its full size, that this is the thing I was not going to be able to live without. Not the ranch, not the basin, not the sky, her. The specific, particular, completely honest her. She looked up from the fence and saw me watching. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "You're looking at me like something." I said, "I'm looking at you like I'm glad you were on that road." She held my gaze across the south pasture in the May morning, and what was in her face was everything that had been building since the rain and the trunk and the mud. In the 30 seconds a man had not been able to see what I had been looking at for 8 months without stopping seeing it. She said, "Me too, Harlan Cross." She turned back to the fence. I went to help her. We worked the fence together in the May light, and the creek ran past and the mountains stood behind us and the crossbar spread around us in every direction, hours, all of it hours, and the day was ordinary and good and completely, irreversibly real. That is the whole story. That is the true version, the one with all the actual materials in it rather than the comfortable ones. If you stayed until the very last word, then you already know that the trunk in the mud was never really the beginning. The beginning was the 30 seconds that revealed what a man was made of, not the man who left, but the man who stopped. Drop a comment with the moment that reached you. Was it the road in the rains, the creek bank in August, the November letter? Like this story if you believe the right people find each other even in the wrong storms. Subscribe because part 2 is coming, and part 2 begins the following autumn when a wagon arrives at the crossbar carrying something Nola has been waiting for since Ohio, and someone none of us expected. Should I tell you who was in that wagon?